You are a good woman, Amara, but good doesn't pay the mortgage. Charlotte is simply a safer investment. With this cold calculation, Lucas abandoned his bride moments before the ceremony, trading 5 years of loyalty for a wealthier woman. He thought he broke her, but the human heart is unpredictable. Amara returns not to beg, but to shine, walking hand in hand with a billionaire who owns the empire Lucas desperately covets. He dumped her for money, but she returned with a man who chose her alone. Watch how the tables turn when true value meets empty ambition. If you were Amara, would you ever forgive such a betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to witness this ultimate moment of justice. The scent of St. Jude's bridal suite was thick enough to choke on, a cloying overdose of white lilies that felt less like a celebration of new life and more like the fragrant, suffocating air of a funeral parlor. Amara Bennett stood frozen in the center of the room, her reflection in the full-length mirror staring back with eyes that were too wide and a smile that refused to reach them. At 28, Amara possessed a beauty that usually commanded a room, deep, radiant skin, and a poise that spoke of quiet strength. But today she looked like a porcelain doll waiting to be shattered. Behind her, Jenna Lewis was currently waging war with the intricate lace of the wedding gown, her face contorted in concentration as she bit through a stray thread with her teeth and spat it onto the polished floorboards with unladylike precision. "Don't hold your breath," Jenna commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy silence as she smoothed the fabric over Amara's waist with hands that were surprisingly gentle, given her aggressive tone. "I had to threaten to burn down the seamstress's shop if she didn't let the waist out another 2 centimeters. So just breathe, okay?" Amara let out a shaky exhale, forcing a weak laugh that sounded brittle even to her own ears as she adjusted the veil. "I'm just afraid," she whispered, her gaze drifting to the closed door that separated her from the hundreds of guests waiting in the sanctuary. "I'm afraid Lucas will see me and think I'm not perfect. His mother is sitting right in the front row, Jenna, and you know how she looks at me, like she's inspecting a used car for scratches." Jenna stopped her fussing and grabbed Amara by the shoulders, spinning her around to face her. "Listen to me," Jenna said, her eyes fierce and protective. "You are Amara Bennett. You are the prize, the greatest thing that has ever happened to his mediocre life. If his mother so much as wrinkles her nose, I will personally shove her into the buffet table." Before Amara could respond to the violent reassurance, the heavy oak door clicked unlatched. It didn't swing open with the exuberance of a groom eager to see his bride. Instead, it opened slowly, calculatingly. Lucas Hart stepped into the room. He was alone without his best man, and he closed the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like the locking of a vault. He was dressed impeccably in his tuxedo, every inch the successful corporate climber. But he didn't look at Amara. His eyes were fixed on a vase of flowers on the side table as he adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist. A nervous tick Amara had seen 1,000 times before business meetings, but never before a kiss. "Lucas?" Amara breathed, stepping forward, her heart leaping with a mix of relief and confusion. "What are you doing here? You know it's bad luck to see each other before the ceremony." She reached out to embrace him, needing his warmth to dispel the cold anxiety in her chest. But Lucas took a sharp step back. He raised a hand, palm out, stopping her mid-stride. "We need to talk," he said, his voice terrifyingly even. "About the numbers." Amara froze, her arms falling uselessly to her sides as the words hung in the air like a physical barrier. "The numbers," she repeated, blinking rapidly. "Now." "Lucas, the music is playing. The priest is waiting." Lucas finally looked at her, but his gaze was devoid of the affection she had seen just yesterday. It was the flat, appraisal-like stare of a banker denying a loan application. "I was looking at the 5-year financial plan again this morning, Amara," he said, smoothing his lapel as if dusting off a speck of dirt. "Love is a variable I can't control, but debt is something I can. I've realized that we aren't fiscally viable." He paused, taking a breath that seemed more about steadying his pitch than gathering courage. "Charlotte Ward. She is a safe investment. Her father's network can advance my position by 10 years with a single nod. She fits the trajectory." The silence that followed was absolute, ringing in Amara's ears louder than the organ music filtering through the walls. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and trembling. "Are you talking about a marriage or a corporate merger?" she asked, her voice cracking as tears welled up, hot and stinging. "Lucas, for 5 years I ate instant noodles so you could pay your MBA tuition. I worked double shifts. I built this life with you brick by brick, and now you're telling me I'm a risky investment?" Lucas didn't flinch at her tears. He merely looked uncomfortable, as if she were making a scene in a boardroom. "That is your problem, Amara," he replied, his tone chillingly polite, masking the cruelty of his logic. "You are too emotional. You are a good woman, truly, but good doesn't pay the mortgage. Good doesn't secure a legacy. Charlotte, she is simply more suitable." Jenna, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly lunged forward like a coiled spring released. "Get the hell out of here before I rip you to shreds!" she screamed, positioning herself between Amara and Lucas like a shield. Lucas didn't cower. He simply checked his watch again, as if the outburst was wasting valuable time. He looked over Jenna's shoulder at Amara, offering a small, regretful nod that felt like a slap in the face. "I am sorry," he said, turning toward the door, "but you will understand later. I am doing this so you can find someone more within your reach." He slipped out the door as quickly as he had entered, leaving Amara standing in the wreckage of her future. The reality of what she had to do next crashed down on her with the weight of the collapsed ceiling. She couldn't stay in the room forever. She had to walk out there, not to the altar, but to the microphone. When Amara finally stepped out of the bride room, stripped of her dignity but still wearing the white dress that now felt like a shroud, the hushed whispers of the congregation turned into a roar of confusion. As she stammered out the announcement that there would be no wedding, she saw a phone raised in the third row. The red recording light blinked like a demonic eye, capturing her humiliation in real time. She wasn't a person anymore. She was content. She was a viral video in the making. The woman dumped for a better portfolio, stripped of her humanity, and reduced to a cautionary tale about the brutal economics of modern love. The 2 weeks following the catastrophe at St. Jude's did not pass in a linear progression of time, but rather dissolved into a suffocating gray fog, a static white noise that drowned out the rhythms of normal life and left Amara Bennett stranded on the beige sectional sofa of Jenna's living room. She had become a ghost in her own existence, wrapped in a duvet that smelled of lavender detergent and pity, while the digital world outside feasted on the carcass of her humiliation with a voracious appetite that terrified her. The video of her announcing the cancellation had gone viral within hours, spawning memes and cruel commentary that dissected her grief as if it were performance art. And the final blow had come 3 days later when her employer terminated her contract via a sterile email, citing that her current public notoriety was inconsistent with the firm's prestigious image. Stripped of her fiancé, her home, her job, and her dignity, Amara felt less like a human woman and more like a discarded object, a defective product that had been recalled from the shelves of society because it failed to meet the new affluent standards set by people like Lucas Hart. While Amara withered in the darkness of the apartment, the world outside celebrated the man who had broken her, as social media feeds became inundated with glossy, high-definition photographs of Lucas and Charlotte Ward attending galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They were being hailed as the city's new power couple, a perfect synthesis of old money and new ambition, and every smiling image felt like a fresh incision into Amara's already mutilated self-esteem. One rainy Tuesday evening, Jenna returned from work to find Amara huddled in the dark, the blue light of her smartphone illuminating a face wet with tears as she zoomed in on a pixelated image of a diamond ring on Charlotte's manicured finger. Jenna, whose patience for Lucas's cruelty had long evaporated, snatched the phone from Amara's trembling hands with the speed of a striking viper, her voice cutting through the gloom with desperate ferocity. "Enough is enough, Amara," she snapped, tossing the device onto the cushion as if it were contaminated. "You are drinking poison and expecting him to die, and I won't watch you decompose on my furniture any longer." Amara looked up, her eyes hollow and dark, her voice devoid of the vibrancy that had once defined her. "They are right, Jenna. Can't you see it?" she whispered, gesturing vaguely at the empty space where the phone had been. Look at her. She shines. She is golden, and I am just the girl in the clearance hoodie who wasn't worth the investment. Jenna grabbed the duvet and yanked it away, exposing Amara to the chill of the room and the harsh reality of her words. You are not a discount item, Jenna retorted, her voice shaking with the intensity of her loyalty. You are a limited edition that a fool like Lucas lacked the sophistication to appraise properly. So get up, put on shoes, and get out of this house before I drag you out myself. Forced by the sheer force of Jenna's will, Amara found herself wandering the wet, glistening streets of the city, the rain masking the tears that refused to stop falling. They walked in silence until Jenna stopped abruptly in front of a narrow, recessed storefront that seemed to belong to a different century, its sign reading, "The Nook" in peeling gold leaf. Unlike the sleek, glass-paneled skyscrapers that Lucas inhabited, the Nook radiated a dusty amber warmth, its window displaying a chaotic jumble of hardcovers and wine bottles that seemed to promise oblivion rather than judgment. Drawn by the silence that seemed to emanate from the glass, Amara pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell above it announcing her arrival with a dull clank that startled an elderly man struggling behind the counter. Mr. Clark, a curmudgeonly figure with wild white hair and a sweater that had seen better decades, was muttering curses at a precarious stack of books he had dropped, seemingly overwhelmed by the task of organization. Without a word, Amara stepped forward, the compulsion to restore order to chaos overriding her depression, and she knelt beside the pile, her hands moving with a mechanical precision as she sorted the titles by author and genre in under 10 seconds. Mr. Clark peered over his spectacles, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion as he watched the intruder rearrange his inventory. "What on earth are you doing?" he grumbled, gesturing at the shelf. "I was arranging them by color to make the display pop for the weekend crowd." Amara placed a heavy volume of Kant onto the shelf, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Philosophy books are not interior decorations, sir," she replied, her tone sharp with the instinctive defense of intellect. "Kant should not be standing next to a cookbook just because their covers are both red. That is an insult to knowledge and a recipe for existential indigestion." The old man paused, his irritation fading into a look of shrewd assessment as he looked her up and down, taking in the hoodie, the damp hair, and the undeniable spark of intelligence in her eyes. "Do you read words, girl, or do you read people?" he asked, his voice losing its edge. Amara looked around the shop, inhaling the scent of vanilla, aging paper, and cheap red wine, and felt a strange, resonant hum in her chest. "I read sadness," she said softly, meeting his gaze, "and this place reeks of it." Mr. Clark let out a short, dry chuckle that sounded like paper crumpling. "Do you know how to pour wine?" he asked, turning back to his ledger. "The pay is terrible, but you get to read the books for free, and more importantly, no suits are allowed inside these walls." The Nook became Amara's sanctuary, a dusty, amber-lit purgatory between the life she had lost and the uncertain future she was too afraid to envision. The air inside always smelled of vanilla pipe tobacco and decaying paper, a scent that acted as a balm to her frayed nerves, and the repetitive, rhythmic work of wiping down the mahogany counter or shelving used paperbacks allowed her mind to drift into a state of numbness that was preferable to the sharp sting of reality. It was a Tuesday night, raining with a relentless, hammering intensity that turned the city streets into rivers of oil and neon, when the brass bell above the door chimed, cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Amara looked up from her copy of Great Expectations, expecting a straggler seeking shelter, and watched as a tall figure stepped out of the deluge and into the warmth of the shop. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his expensive charcoal suit clinging uncomfortably to his frame. Yet he moved with a deliberate, quiet grace that seemed at odds with the chaotic weather. He did not shake himself off like a wet dog or complain about the storm. Instead, he carefully folded his dripping umbrella and placed it in the stand with precision, ensuring it wouldn't puddle onto Mr. Clark's worn floorboards before adjusting a chair that was slightly askew and sitting down at the far end of the bar. He looked exhausted, not with the physical fatigue of a laborer, but with the deep, bone-weary drain of a man who has spent too many hours carrying the weight of other people's expectations. He didn't even glance at the chalkboard menu. Adrian Cole, though Amara did not know his name, or the billions attached to it, loosened his silk tie with a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire posture. "Give me something cheap," he said, his voice a low baritone that scratched against the silence. "The kind of red wine where you won't regret it if I accidentally knock the glass over, because I'm too tired to hold it." Amara reached for the house bottle, a generic Merlot that Mr. Clark bought in bulk, but she didn't just pour it. She polished the glass until it gleamed under the pendant lights, treating the $5 liquid with the reverence usually reserved for a vintage Bordeaux. She slid the glass toward him, her movements fluid and practiced. "Cheap or expensive doesn't matter much in here," she replied softly, catching his eye for the first time. "The important question is, do you drink to taste the wine, or do you drink to forget the day?" Adrian paused, his hand hovering over the stem of the glass, and looked up at her with a start, as if surprised to find a sentient being behind the counter rather than a vending machine. The fatigue in his eyes receded slightly, replaced by a flicker of genuine interest. "To forget a long day," he admitted, swirling the dark liquid. "A day where people only looked at the chair I sat in, or the title on my door, but never actually looked at my face." "What about you?" he asked, tilting his head. "Why do you pour the wine?" Amara felt a lump form in her throat, a sudden swell of honesty provoked by his directness. "To remember," she whispered, wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. "To remember that I am still useful to someone, even if I am just a passerby in their story." They drank in silence for a moment, the sound of the rain against the glass creating a cocoon around them, before Adrian's gaze drifted to the book she had left face down on the counter. He reached out and tapped the cover of the Dickens novel with a long finger. "Pip," he said, a small, cynical smile touching his lips. He wasted his entire life trying to become a gentleman for a girl who was incapable of loving him. The man was a fool. Amara stopped wiping the counter, her defensive instincts flaring up not just for the fictional character, but for the part of herself that recognized the desperation in Pip's journey. "No," she countered, her voice firming. "He didn't try to become a gentleman because he was a fool. He did it because he thought he wasn't good enough, as he was. That is a tragedy, not stupidity. When someone makes you feel like you are lesser, like you are beneath them, you will do anything to prove them wrong, even if it means losing yourself." The words hung heavy in the air, charged with the phantom pain of Lucas's rejection, and Adrian went still. He looked at her, really looked at her, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Has anyone ever made you feel like you weren't good enough?" he asked quietly, the question stripping away the polite veneer of strangerhood. Amara let out a laugh that was devoid of humor, a sharp, jagged sound. "The whole world," she replied, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "My ex-fiancé, his family, the internet, everyone. And you?" Adrian took a slow sip of the cheap wine, savoring it as if it were nectar. "I have the opposite problem," he confessed, his voice dropping to a murmur. "People always assume I am too much because of what I own, or what my family built. They see the assets, the legacy, the numbers, but no one ever asks who I actually am. Sometimes," he added, looking into the depths of his glass, "having too much is just as lonely as not having enough." From that night on, the dynamic shifted. Adrian became a fixture at the Nook, arriving promptly at 9 p.m. like clockwork, always seeking the same stool and the same cheap wine. They stopped being customer and server and became conspirators in a quiet rebellion against the noise of the outside world, building a delicate intimacy constructed not of physical touch, but of shared thoughts and intellectual vulnerability. He never looked at his phone when she spoke, granting her the kind of undivided attention Lucas had never been capable of giving. And for the first time in months, Amara felt seen, not as a failed bride or a financial liability, but as a woman with a mind that mattered. She didn't know he was a billionaire hiding from his own empire, and he didn't care about the scandal that had ruined her reputation. In the dim light of the bookstore, they were just two lonely souls finding solace in the fact that, for a few hours a day, they didn't have to be anyone but themselves. The intimacy between Amara and Adrian had blossomed, not in the grand gestures of romance novels, but in the quiet, dusty corners of the Nook. Yet it was a plate of spaghetti carbonara at a cramped, family-run trattoria that finally made Amara believe she might be healing. The restaurant was the antithesis of the Michelin-starred glass cages Lucas had preferred. Here, the checkered tablecloths were stained with the ghosts of past meals. The air smelled of garlic and genuine laughter, and Adrian Cole looked utterly content, devouring pasta as if it were his last meal on earth. He wore a knitted sweater that had seen better days, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms that seemed too strong for a man who claimed to spend his days pushing paper. And on his left wrist sat a watch with a scratched face and a worn leather strap that looked like it had been salvaged from a pawn shop bin. For the first time in months, Amara felt the ice around her heart thawing, replaced by the terrifying warmth of hope. Because here was a man who laughed at her jokes, listened to her theories on literature with rapt attention, and seemed to possess nothing of value except a kind heart and a sharp mind. She allowed herself to imagine a future that was small but sturdy, built on shared books and cheap wine, oblivious to the fact that the man sitting across from her could buy the entire city block without checking his bank balance. The illusion of their humble normality shattered the following morning, not with a bang, but with the frantic scrolling of Jenna Lewis, whose protective instincts had evolved into a form of forensic paranoia. Jenna had been analyzing a blurry photo taken by a bystander the night before, a shot of Adrian walking Amara to her Uber in the rain, and her eyes had snagged on the watch peeking out from under his cuff. It wasn't the watch itself that triggered her alarm bells, but the specific curvature of the lugs, a detail she recognized from a documentary on vintage auctions she had watched during a bout of insomnia. Driven by a suspicion she couldn't name, Jenna spent 3 hours cross-referencing horology forms until the truth stared back at her from the glowing screen of her laptop. A truth so staggering, it made her scream Amara's name with the urgency of a fire alarm. The watch wasn't a piece of junk. It was a Patek Philippe reference 1518 in stainless steel, a rare heirloom worth millions, and a quick search of the surname Cole alongside the image of the watch revealed the face of the man Amara had been falling for, not as a struggling reader, but as the reclusive heir to the Cole hospitality empire, the businessman of the year, 3 years running. When Adrian walked into the Nook that evening, shaking the rain from his coat with his usual quiet humility, he did not find the warm welcome he had grown accustomed to. Instead, he walked into a silence so cold it felt like a physical blow. Amara stood behind the counter, her posture rigid, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, looking at him not as her companion, but as a stranger who had violated her sanctuary. Without a word, she reached under the counter and produced a copy of the Financial Times, slamming it down onto the mahogany surface with a heavy, final thud that made the wine glasses tremble. The front page feature showed Adrian cutting a ribbon at a new luxury resort, looking every inch the titan of industry in a bespoke suit, a stark contrast to the man in the damp sweater standing before her. Adrian looked down at his own face staring back from the newsprint, and he didn't flinch or offer a frantic denial. He simply sighed, a sound of profound resignation, as if he had known this moment was inevitable and had dreaded it with every fiber of his being. Adrian Cole, Amara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and humiliation, reciting the name like an accusation. Tech billionaire, heir to the Cole Hotel chain. So who is the man who comes here to drink $5 wine every night? Is he a character? Is this some kind of poverty tourism for you? A little role play to see how the other half lives before you go back to your mansion? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and poisonous, but Adrian didn't back away. No, he said, his voice steady but laced with sadness. That is me. That is who I am when I leave the name Cole and the bank accounts outside the door. Amara let out a harsh, broken laugh, tears finally spilling over as the betrayal cut deeper than Lucas's abandonment, because this felt like a mockery of her reality. Do you know what the worst feeling is? She asked, her voice cracking. It's that I had started to believe that finally there was someone who liked me for Amara. Not because I was a trophy or a liability. You made me feel like I was part of something real, but I was just entertainment for a rich man bored with his caviar. Adrian moved then, walking around the barrier of the bar not with aggression, but with an urgency that compelled Amara to hold her ground. Amara, look at me, he commanded, his voice dropping to a register of raw honesty that arrested her spiraling thoughts. I didn't hide it to trick you. I hid it because I was afraid. Amara scoffed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. What does a billionaire have to be afraid of? That I'm a gold digger? Adrian shook his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. No, he replied. I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you would look at me with the eyes of everyone else out there. Or worse, you would look at me through the lens of your own insecurity. You would run away before I could prove that I am just a man who likes to listen to you talk about books. The words struck Amara with the force of a revelation, silencing her anger and replacing it with a cold, hard mirror reflecting her deepest fear. That she wasn't running from his lie, but from the terrifying possibility that she didn't believe she was enough for a man like him. The reconciliation between Amara and Adrian did not happen with fireworks or grand declarations, but in the quiet, fragile space of honest admission where trust is slowly rebuilt, brick by brick. He had asked her to trust him one last time, not as a billionaire, but as the man who knew how she took her coffee and which chapter of Dickens made her cry. And Amara had agreed, though her heart still hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she stood before the gilded doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel. She was no longer wearing the clearance rack hoodies that had defined her months of depression. Instead, she was encased in a floor-length gown of crimson silk that hugged her curves like a second skin, a garment that screamed confidence and danger in equal measure. Jenna had sold her prized designer handbag, the one she had saved for 2 years to pay for it, shoving the dress into Amara's arms with a fierceness that brokered no argument, declaring that if Amara was going to walk into the lion's den, she would do so looking like the queen of the jungle rather than a sacrificial lamb. The event inside was a dual-purpose monstrosity, a charity auction sponsored by the Cole Group, conveniently doubling as the engagement party for the city's newest power couple, Lucas Hart and Charlotte Ward. As the doors swung open, the blast of air conditioning and expensive perfume hit Amara, but she didn't flinch. She walked into the ballroom with her head high, scanning the sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns until her eyes landed on them. Lucas and Charlotte stood at the center of the room, holding court like royalty, basking in the flash of cameras and the sycophantic laughter of people who only cared about their net worth. It didn't take long for Lucas to spot the splash of red cutting through the monochrome crowd. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of annoyance mixed with panic, and he excused himself from a group of investors, marching toward Amara with the swift, aggressive stride of a man trying to dispose of a problem before it caused a scene. He intercepted her near the champagne fountain, blocking her path with his body, as if she were a contagion he needed to contain. I don't recall sending you an invitation, Lucas hissed, his voice low and tight, his eyes darting around to ensure no one of importance was watching this reunion. Amara, don't do this to yourself. Don't make yourself a laughingstock again. The last bus back to your neighborhood is still running, and I suggest you catch it. He looked at her with a pity that was more insulting than hatred, genuinely believing he was offering her mercy from her own irrelevance. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and realized with a jolt of shock that the fear was gone. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo trying too hard to impress people he didn't like. She reached out, her hands steady, and adjusted the knot of his silk tie. Your tie is crooked, Lucas, she said calmly, her voice smooth and devoid of the tremor he expected. The perfection you are chasing, it is fragile, isn't it? Before Lucas could process the audacity of her touch, Charlotte materialized at his elbow, her eyes raking over Amara's dress with a mixture of envy and disdain. Oh, the ex-fiancé, Charlotte drawled, clutching Lucas's arm as if claiming a prize. Did you come here to ask for the deposit back on your wedding dress? Or perhaps you are here to apply for a waitressing position? We are short-staffed near the kitchen. The couple smirked in unison, a united front of arrogance, waiting for Amara to crumble or scream. But the air in the room suddenly shifted. The ambient chatter died down, replaced by a ripple of hushed whispers that moved through the crowd like a wave. And the hotel's general manager, a man who had ignored Lucas's demands all evening, came sprinting across the marble floor with a look of terrified deference on his face. He wasn't running toward Lucas. He was running past him. "Mr. Cole!" The manager, breathless, bowing slightly as he stopped in front of the tall figure who had quietly stepped out of the shadows behind Amara. "We didn't know you would be personally inspecting the event tonight, sir. Everything for your auction is ready, just as your office requested." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucas froze, the smirk sliding off his face like wet clay as his brain struggled to reconcile the image of the billionaire tycoon Adrian Cole with the man standing casually next to his ex-girlfriend. Adrian was wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Lucas's car, but his eyes were cold, boring into Lucas with the indifference of a mountain looking at an ant. "Cole?" Lucas stammered, his face draining of color until he looked like a ghost. "Adrian? Cole? But he is." Adrian didn't even acknowledge Lucas's existence. He stepped forward, placing a protective, possessive hand on the small of Amara's back, and turned his attention entirely to her. "My love," he said, his voice warm and rich, carrying clearly in the silent hall. "Do you want to introduce me to your old friends, or shall we go straight up to the VIP section? It is a little too noisy down here for my taste." The power dynamic in the room inverted in a single heartbeat. Charlotte's grip on Lucas's arm slackened as she realized the man she had been trying to network with all night belonged to the woman she had just insulted. All eyes were on Amara now, not as the victim, but as the victor. She looked at Lucas, who was trembling slightly, and then at Charlotte, who looked ready to faint, and gave a small, serene smile. She turned to Adrian, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. "Just an acquaintance, darling," she said softly, dismissing 5 years of history and pain with 3 simple words. "He is not important. Let's go." As they walked away toward the private elevators, leaving a stunned Lucas in their wake, Amara didn't look back, for there was nothing behind her that mattered anymore. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Plaza ballroom swung shut with a muffled thud that severed the connection between the suffocating applause inside and the hushed, velvet-lined sanctuary of the corridor, leaving Amara Bennett walking away from the scene of her triumph with steps that were measured, rhythmic, and echoing the steady beat of a heart that was finally, after months of erratic fluttering, no longer afraid of breaking. But the silence she sought was short-lived, shattered almost immediately by the frantic, uneven footsteps of a man losing control. And before she could reach the alcove of the private elevators, Lucas Hart's hand clamped onto her elbow, his grip desperate and clammy. He was flushed, his bow tie askew, the cool corporate mask he had worn so effortlessly for 5 years cracking to reveal the grasping, panicked creature beneath. And he pulled her toward him, his eyes darting around the empty hallway to ensure no important investors were witnessing his unraveling. "Amara, wait! You can't just walk away with him," Lucas panted, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that made her skin crawl with its assumed intimacy. "You don't know what you are doing, Amara. Look at me. Charlotte is just a shell. She is cold. She isn't like you. She doesn't understand the struggle like we do." Amara looked down at the hand on her arm, the same hand that had once held hers while they planned a future, the same hand that had pointed to the door when he kicked her out. And she felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity, gently removing his grip not with force, but with the casual dismissal one might use to brush off a speck of lint from a silk dress. "Are you really doing this, Lucas?" she asked, her voice calm and devoid of the tremor he clearly expected to hear. "Are you trying to negotiate a reconciliation in the hallway of your own engagement party while your fiancé waits inside?" Lucas didn't back down, instead leaning in closer, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and delusion as he tried to play the only card he had left. "I am thinking about our future," he insisted, the words tumbling out in a rush of manic logic. "Think about it, Amara, with my position now secured through the wards, and your connection to Cole, we could be unstoppable. We could be the team I always talked about, the power couple that actually matters. You think he loves you? A man like Adrian Cole doesn't love shop girls, Amara. He is just playing a game of poverty tourism. But only I know the real you. Only I know what you've been through and how hard you worked to get here. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a greatest hits collection of every insecurity he had ever planted in her mind to keep her small. But tonight the soil of her soul was barren to his toxicity. Amara stepped back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the vast emotional chasm between them, and looked him dead in the eye, seeing the smallness of him for the first time without the rose-colored glasses of love. "You are right about one thing," she said, her voice cutting through his tirade like a laser. "You know my past, you know how hard I worked, and you know how much I sacrificed, but you are wrong about why we are standing here. You didn't leave me because I was poor, Lucas. And you didn't leave me because Charlotte was a better financial option. You left me because your soul is too poor to contain kindness. You left because you are incapable of waiting for a seed to grow, and you only want to harvest fruit you didn't plant." Lucas opened his mouth to argue, to spin another web of justification, but Amara raised a hand, silencing him with a finality that struck him dumb. "And thank you," she added, her voice softening into genuine gratitude. "Thank you for letting go of my hand that day, because thanks to you, I learned that my hand deserves to hold something better than a calculator." She turned and walked away, the red silk of her dress flowing behind her like a victory banner, leaving Lucas standing alone in the empty corridor, a man who had sold everything for a price tag and ended up with absolutely nothing of value. The private balcony was a world away from the suffocating pretension of the ballroom, a quiet haven of cool night air and moonlight that overlooked the glittering sprawl of the city, and Adrian was waiting for her by the stone railing, two glasses of wine resting on the balustrade, his silhouette framed against the skyline like a guardian of her peace. He wasn't looking at his phone, checking stock prices, or worrying about the press. He was just waiting, patient and still, and Amara joined him, the tension of the encounter with Lucas draining from her shoulders as she inhaled the crisp air. She picked up one of the glasses, swirling the dark liquid under the moonlight, and gave him a small, tired smile. "I have to be honest," she said, leaning against the railing. "I think I prefer the $5 Merlot at Mr. Clark's shop because this stuff, it tastes a bit too much like oak and heavy expectations." Adrian chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound that settled deep in her chest, and clinked his glass against hers. "I agree," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It tries too hard to impress, so shall we go home?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound, stripping away the complexity of their disparate worlds. "Home?" Amara asked, arching an eyebrow playfully. "Your penthouse or my friend's couch?" Adrian set his glass down and turned to face her, his expression shifting from amusement to a deep, anchoring seriousness as he reached into his pocket. He didn't drop to one knee to make a spectacle for an audience that wasn't there. Instead, he simply pulled out a small velvet pouch and extracted a ring. Not a boulder of a diamond meant to signal wealth to the cheap seats, but a band of brushed gold, elegant and understated, with a small, intricate inscription carved into the inner curve. He held it out to her, not as a transaction or a rescue, but as an offering between equals. "Home is wherever you are," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "Amara, I have a billion reasons why I shouldn't get married. Lawyers, shareholders, the media. They all say it's a bad investment, but I only have one reason to do it." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had scrubbed counters and shelved books during the darkest months of her life. "I want to be the man who pours your wine at the end of the day, whether it's vintage Pinot or tap water. And I don't want to save you, Amara, because you saved yourself long before I walked into that bookstore. I just want to walk next to you while you do it." Amara looked at the ring, squinting to read the tiny Latin words etched inside. "Aut viam inveniam au faciem. I will find a way, or I will make one." The quote from the very first book she had recommended to him, echoing in the night air like a vow. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being understood by someone who saw her scars as a map rather than a defect. "You know I come with debt," she said, her voice wavering slightly as she looked up at him. I am still paying off my student loans. I have emotional baggage, and I am essentially a fixer-upper project. Adrian smiled, taking the ring and sliding it gently onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been forged specifically for her skin. I am in finance, remember? He teased gently, pulling her into him until their foreheads rested against each other in a gesture of infinite trust. I like high-risk investments because they usually yield the highest returns. So, will you let me pay the installments on this life with you? Amara laughed, a sound that was free and light, releasing the last ghosts of the girl who had cried in the bridal suite, and pulled him down for a kiss. I think, she whispered against his lips, that is a deal I can accept. Oh, what defines your true worth? Share your thoughts on Amara's journey in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe. See you next time.